And welcome back. From jazz, we transition into our third segment of the morning, and we will be having a discussion, all things about the state of refugees in the country, correct? All right, and of course, we're going to be discussing with the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. We have with us the head of office, Andreas Wissner. Good morning.
Morning.
We also have the director of the Refugees Department for UNHCR, Marin. Good morning.
Good morning.
For the government.
For the
government.
Yes.
All right. So, refugees, it's a broad term in terms of persons who are with status, without status. How does that work? Let's begin by having a broad conversation on it first.
Well, we basically start with asylum seekers because those are the persons who are seeking protection, they're seeking safety, and they are referred to, as far as we're concerned in Belize, as asylum seekers while they are in the process of application. Once you are granted the status, then you become a recognized refugee.
Okay.
So that would be the difference. So we have, at the moment, we have asylum seekers because those are persons who have applied, who have not yet obtained a response to their application. But we also have recognized refugees in Belize.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Let's take a step back. I think being able to understand the situation of refugees in Belize means we must go back to agreements that were made many years ago. And even the previous time, there was an established entity to work along with refugees and processing refugees as they came into Belize. And that was back in the 80s, right? That's the case. So let's step back into that time and then talk about what's different now.
Well, in those days, tens of thousands of persons requiring international protection actually fled from neighboring Central American countries into Belize to flee for their lives, affected by the civil wars that were then ongoing in El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, etc. And they found a safe place here, and the international community worked with Belize to establish new communities to host them. And many of those communities, of course, are continuing here in Belize, and they have now become regular Belizean communities. And some of them, like Valley of Peace, are now like providing good part of the vegetables that are available on the markets, especially agricultural centers. So they have really contributed also to the development and added to the diversity of Belize that has always been one of the main characteristics of this country. So
at that time, there was an agreement made that we'd accept the people who were fleeing war from our neighboring countries, civil war. And we established communities, Salvador, Valley of Peace, there's several others, I'm sure. And it was a sign of cooperation, right?
Right, yes.
Yeah.
That was a great international cooperation, but based on international principles, of course, that Belize has also accepted at that time. It was in the 90s that Belize acceded to the International Convention on the Status of Refugees, and also it put in place its first and still applicable National Refugees Act, according to which the current refugee protection procedure is also being organized.
So following that time, things did get dormant after a while. In fact, UNHCR didn't have an office in the country. And now, I think it was since 2016, you have returned. So what has changed in terms of the landscape, that there's now a need, once again, to have an established office and, of course, the refugee department?
In fact, the problems had taken quite a positive direction by the end of the 1990s, and most of the refugees at that time either could return back after the end of the civil war or could be integrated permanently in Belize. So our presence was no longer required to the same extent as before, even though there was a continuous trickle of persons seeking international protection, but it didn't require a permanent presence. And even the same conclusion was done on the side of the government. So the Refugees Department was discontinued, also the Refugee Eligibility Committee. And it was only in the course of the 2000s, 2010s, that then more and more people started fleeing again, this time not so much from civil war, but because of and the increasing gang violence in the north of Central America. And that eventually triggered the need to reactivate the dormant refugee structures in Belize, and UNHCR came back to assist the government to make these structures functional and to give international protection to those who need it most, and who are entitled to it according to international law.
How does that work from our end in terms of the government looking at the situation, for instance, in parts of Honduras or in El Salvador, and allowing or agreeing to have persons come in and seek asylum in the country?
Well, the basis of the reception of these persons seeking safety and protection lies in the international agreement, which, as you heard earlier, we acceded to in 1990. We actually formulated it into our domestic legislation in 1991. So on that basis, we have the responsibility to accept persons who are seeking asylum, who are fleeing for their lives, their safety, etc. But we basically look to information on the country of origin, where these persons are coming from. We do the necessary research. We engage very closely with UNHCR because they are the ones who have the resources internationally and in all these areas. And they actually provide us with accurate information as to what is happening. Then we can basically say, when a person presents himself or herself at the department with a claim, I need protection, I fear for my life, we know that if these persons are coming from these areas, the most likely situation is, based on the information that we have gotten, that what they are saying merits international protection. So we go back to that type of information. We go back to researching what's available, what's happening out there, especially in those countries that we see persons presenting themselves from.
Now, the process that you just explained, I think, is one that we need to discuss further, because people don't necessarily come into the country and present themselves at the department.
Right.
And so I have two questions. One, what happened to the people who came into the country during the time that there was no department set up? And what happens to people who have never presented themselves to the department but are living here, whether they entered legally or illegally, and are not, they have no status?
Okay. The Refugees Department has a mandate.
Yes.
And its mandate is the local legislation in the form of the Belize Refugees Act.
Yes.
Okay.
So first and foremost, we must carry out our mandate as per that act.
Yeah.
So there are two things. Before we became a department, as mentioned earlier, Help for Progress, which is the implementing partner for UNHCR after they left in the 1990s, was doing all that part of it, accepting people, assisting people with their applications. That application and person were then referred to the Immigration Department at that time, because there was a desk at the Immigration Department that dealt with that. Subsequent to that, though, in May of 2016, we were reestablished as a department. In 2016, June of 2016, we became operational. And so the persons then were being referred, that came to Help for Progress, were being referred to the department. And as such, then we had to implement not only the basis upon which you can accept a claim, which is that you meet the definition of a refugee as per the convention, which is the same definition that is in the Refugees Act, along with a little broader one that we have adopted. And so we implemented that, first and foremost, that you meet the definition of a refugee, and secondly, that you present yourself within the time frame that the Refugees Act requires that you do, which is a 14 days time frame. That is where we saw a lot of persons not meeting a requirement. And so we basically had to go by the law. So if you come to us and you meet the refugee definition and you meet the 14-day limitation, you are registered as an asylum seeker.
So what happens to those who did not within the first 2 weeks of entering the country?
We have been able to, in dialogue and discussion, because these persons may very well have a genuine claim.
Yeah.
Not meeting a time frame does not negate the fact that you have suffered, or you have been threatened, or some form of serious harm may come to you.
Yeah.
So what we have done is, in partnership with the Immigration Department, the good thing is we are under the same ministry, we basically refer these persons to the Immigration Department to allow them consideration for them to regularize their status and not have to go back to a situation in which they would fear harm.
Can we draw a scenario here? So, for instance, in El Salvador, where you have the situation of the MS-13 and the other gangs. And so their thing is extortion and threat to, A family decides, you know what, as business owners, we can't keep paying these gangs what they're demanding of us in terms of a protection fee, so to speak. And so the family packs up and comes to Belize. But they may not necessarily be fully versed on what the laws are, the requirements are. So when they get here, they're not privy to the fact that you need to declare within the 14-day window.
Right.
Yeah.
You're saying, you're saying that there perhaps is a legitimate reason there as to why they're fleeing from their home country, but the application or the declaration, as it were, comes beyond the 14-day window. You would still consider, you'd still put that up for consideration. Is that what you're saying?
That's a real problematic point which has been recognized, and we were working very closely with the government now in a framework that goes even beyond Belize to empower the government to put in place referral procedures so that people who are crossing the border can have effective access to the procedure within 14 days. So it's really, there's a lot of need to make sure that at the border, people who are coming in are informed that they need to apply within these 14 days. UNHCR has a critical outlook, as you can imagine on any time limitations to apply for refugee status, because by definition of international law, refugee status is not time-bound. You are a refugee when you are have a fear of international persecution and facing violence in your home country. Therefore, if a person who has made a protection claim beyond the 14 days provided according to Belizean law, for us, there may still be in need of international protection. And also, according to the Belizean Refugees Act, there's a provision in Article 14 that no one who has a fear of persecution may actually be returned to a situation of persecution to their home countries, regardless of having been accepted into the asylum procedure. That creates a little bit of a dilemma.
Yeah. That leaves a gray area,
This
clearly.
leaves a gray area which is not really covered very well, but we are working, engaging with the government to hopefully close in a future legal reform this gap that exists in the Belizean Refugee Act. But in the meantime, we're trying to make sure that people know about their rights, about their obligations when they come into the country. We'll open a new resource and referral center in Benke just on the 13th of June in World Refugee Day month, and working very closely with the authority, with civil society stakeholders, so that people who cross the border can have access to additional information, to resources, to some first instance, and then maybe transportation assistance to Belmopan, because the only place where they can actually make a formal asylum request is the Refugees Department, Ms. Marin's department in Belmopan, that you have just shown the pictures of. So this is a very centralized and procedure, and getting into the procedure is, as you said, it's not easy at all.
But in addition to what Mr. Wissner is saying, one of the first things that we did as a department back in 2016 was to start informing the law enforcement officers, especially via the Immigration Department. Because anyone that is detained for an immigration violation, illegal entry, for example, will be referred to the Immigration Department. And so we started a training along with UNHCR of law enforcement officers. So we included immigration, police, magistrates, military like BDF, and even Coast Guard in an instance. And so the idea there was for them to understand the concept of a refugee and the limit, how crucial it is, how critical it is for these persons, once they make a declaration, once they present a claim, to any person out there, and this can be this can go beyond a law enforcement officer, that they remember that they have a 14-day limitation. So they must. We were impressing this upon the law enforcement officers, so that when they come across these persons at border points, at checkpoints, or wherever it is, that they keep at the forefront of their minds that, you know what, they have only 14 days, and to advise these people of that 14-day and where to go for that 14-day. But we've gone beyond that, and we have developed the referral procedures for these entities. We included training for social workers in the Human Services Department, where we were able to capture a majority of them, because wherever we have at the border points coming from immigration, we have persons who you identify immediately are vulnerable people. And so the first thing that an immigration officer will do is refer this person to a social worker. And so we also engage in that type of training to impress that 14-day limitation. The fact that is also was being impressed at that time was the Section 14 in the Belize Refugees Act, where you are not to deport or to return a person. You cannot refuse a person entry into Belize if they present a claim regarding fear for life, safety, freedom.
What I'm hearing from you is that there's essentially a population of people who can't be categorized. They've missed the 14-day window. They can't be returned because there's an actual threat to life if they return home. So you said that the alternative mechanism is to get them to go through the processes at the immigration department.
To regularize.
To regularize.
Yeah.
Let's get a picture of what the current situation is. So since the opening of the department and the reestablishment of UNHCR in country, how many people have actually come in to apply or make a declaration as an asylum seeker?
We have at the moment some 3,500 persons registered as asylum seekers. Yes.
And it's not an automatic process. They have to go to the Refugee Eligibility Committee.
Well, first of all, let's start from the beginning. You present yourself to the registration officer at the department, who will do a pre-screening. We'll listen to your declaration. Based on the 2 criteria, we will then register you. We'll give you an application form. We will ask you to fill out that application form. If you have any supporting documents for evidence of proof, then we copy that at that point. If you don't have, then we accept your application form with whatever form of ID you're bringing with you. At that point in time, you are given a permit to reside in Belize because you are now a registered asylum seeker, and the law provides for persons to remain in country as asylum seekers or refugees until you are given a response, right? So you have no problem residing in Belize. You, however, must present yourself every 3 months. To
Can you work with that permit?
No, that's only for legal stay. That's only for a permit to reside in Belize. You cannot work with that, no.
So you can't access healthcare, you
yes,
can't
you
work?
can.
Okay.
Yes, you can. You can access basic services, but you cannot work with that.
Okay.
With that permit. That permit is basically to fulfill the requirement at Section 9 of the Refugees Act that says that once you're a registered asylum seeker, you're permitted to reside in Belize legally until you get a response. So after that, you're given an interview date. You will come in at some point in time later on to present your case in detail to an eligibility or adjudicating officer. That officer will do the necessary research prior to and post to the interview. It's a credibility interview assessment. And so once that has been done, the officer prepares a report and forwards that report with the file along with some notes. The notes that person took to the Refugee Eligibility Committee, which meets once a month. The committee is made up of, it's a multi-agency. I think we have like 5 or 6 government ministries represented, and we have 3 or 4 NGOs or civil society
Multidisciplinary
organizations. Very
bodies.
very
So you
multi.
review
strongly
all these
set up.
applications.
They review and they consider,
Okay.
and then a majority vote decision is made as to whether that person should be recognized as a refugee.
Okay.
How do you live until then, though? Because you've mentioned
That's a concern.
3-month window in terms of returning
To the department.
You're not allowed to work.
No.
How do you get shelter, food?
This shows the resilience of these people. In fact, that they are managing to survive. Most of them, of course, they're residing with members of similar communities that have already come to Belize in the 80s and 90s, where they can receive some protection and community assistance. UNHCR is much concerned that it takes a long while for refugee status to be determined in Belize, and in the meantime, applicants are not officially allowed to work. They can, however, eke out a living in the informal sectors of the economy that do exist, especially in the rural areas. The Salvadorans are known to be capable farmers, and they still engage in working with local farmers as farm hands, or even toiling on a little plot of land that may be available. But also in the urban areas, they do sewing classes, they do sewing, they do baking, small-scale income generation activities, so that they can survive on this. But it's not easy, and of course a lot of potential is wasted because they cannot really participate in the society. Also, they cannot go to high school, because for high school you need a social security card. Primary school is available. Medical care is also available at the basic level, but when more difficult surgery becomes available, it becomes challenging. Humanitarian assistance that UNHCR provides via Help for Progress is normally limited to 3 months only, but decisions are not reached in 3 months.
Yeah.
So you've received about 3,000, you said, applications. How many?
3,500 persons have applied.
How many have been approved? Through the
We
committee?
have 28, through the committee,
Yeah.
About a little over 500.
Okay.
500.
What happened to the other persons who didn't meet the criteria?
Those that are not successful and have gone to the eligibility committee are again notified and again referred to the immigration department for regularization. That's the best we can do at the moment.
Isn't
There's
this a
also
catch
another
22?
gap here that needs to be mentioned. So the eligibility committee has put forward about 500 applications saying that these persons have met the criteria to be refugees, but that process has not been completed.
Not as yet.
For how long?
Even after the Refugee Eligibility Committee has put forward their recommendation to accept someone as a refugee, the law requires that the minister in charge of immigration and refugees endorses that decision formally. That's a legal requirement of the Refugees Act in Belize. That means even these 500, and more exactly 577 that have been put forward by the Refugees Eligibility Committee, they don't know about the lack of having been selected as refugees, because it still requires the minister's endorsement. And so for the time being, we're still waiting, and we're engaging with the government and with the ministers concerned to come forward with this endorsement.
Now, I believe the minister was asked about that a few months ago, about why these haven't been formalized as yet. Has there been any action I mean, what needs to be done if all the process has been vetted? What's the hold up in signing?
That's a good thing. Exactly. I think there are some concerns at the political level. I think there may be some political reluctance that recognizing this number of refugees in Belize may overload coping systems in a small country as Belize. But of course, from a legal point of view, they should definitely be recognized, and they have been vetted. They have been found by the competent Belizean authorities to qualify as refugees. So we are continuing engaging with the different ministers, so that their recognition can move ahead very soon.
Isn't this a unique dilemma for anyone to find him or herself in, having to flee your home country and seek protection elsewhere, but in terms of what you're able to do to survive, it's still very limited, because the process, you'll forgive me, seems very bureaucratic?
We realize, the issues that are out there, and we are the ones who basically see these people over and over and hear their plight. One of the things that we have done is we have gotten together as a working group of the committee, of the Eligibility Committee, and we have put forward proposals so that there are considerations for sections of the Refugees Act that for the time being are not really providing for these persons to really be able to survive, to continue. And we're basically awaiting a response on those proposals, those recommendations for a revision for the 14-day limitation, the work authorization. We know that it is very difficult. They come from a very difficult situation. And the idea is to relieve them, to provide them with some level of protection and safety. So we're hopeful. We're hopeful that those will be accepted.
And in the meantime, UNHCR is engaging in a number of very effective community projects for these persons of concern, as we call them, persons in need of international protection who haven't received full refugee status yet, to facilitate their de facto integration in the host communities, like sewing classes, English as second language offers, to capacitate them to participate to the extent possible in the Belizean society.
You have temporary housing and things like that available.
Temporary housing is, of course, it costs more money. It's an individual assistance. For that, unfortunately, we have a limited budget. And this is normally they have this 3 months rule. So many people are really requiring family assistance. But there is also a risk as the longer they stay and if they are not able to really effectively participate in the informal economies, then that they become at risk of exploitation and abuse by unscrupulous businessmen, for instance.
Now, Andreas, we need to give this conversation, I think, a broader context, because what we've painted, obviously, is a troubling scenario, which anyone hearing will say, well, what does a person do if they're here almost in limbo? But globally, the conversation about refugees and migration has become a very political issue. From Europe to, we're more dominated by US news. And it has become a very polarizing issue. One that I'm sure viewers are watching and saying, 3,000 new people, what about us? We can't get jobs. How do you keep the education going about the human rights core of this issue? And also where people may feel threatened that we're already in a poor country. I mean, how much more can we provide for others?
Well, these days in the world, there are 68 million displaced, forcibly displaced persons. 85% of them are actually displaced in the developing world. So Belize is not an exception to the rule. Refugee protection is a question of international solidarity, compassion, burden sharing. This is what's being implemented in this region, with the help of the international community. Belize is not alone. Neighboring countries are in the same situation. They are not so much more developed. They don't have such a much higher national income yet. Many of them are opening their countries for refugees, at least to the same or better extent than Belize is doing. And it's really a question of working together and sharing available resources with the help of the international community. The fact that we are here in UNHCR, we stand ready to come in. If there are more refugee recognitions, there will be integration programs, so there won't be a burden for Belize. But we cannot fully engage, of course, as long as the recognition process has not yet been fully completed, because if we engage more on the ones who are still pending as applicants, we don't know how the outcome will be in the end and whether our money is well invested. In the 1990s, we had a major investment by the international communities building infrastructure in places like Valley of Peace, Armenia, and all along the Western Highway to San Ignacio for the newly established refugee villages also around Belmopan. And this has created a lot of new momentum, I think, also for national development. So we believe in UNHCR that refugee protection and community support can make an important contribution also to the development of a country that is accepting to host refugees among its population.
And from you, Maria, what I'd like to hear before we close is You've interacted directly with persons who are seeking, who are asylum seekers. For us in Belize, we don't necessarily know as much of what's happening around us in Central America, and we don't see outright wars. What's a typical scenario you would explain to people about who the asylum seekers are?
Many of these persons are very humble, come from very humble backgrounds. Persons who have been targeted because of their age, because of their gender, because of what they own, as little as it might be that they own, they are targets. They are persons who have suffered threats or harm, have been harmed or have been threatened for, like you mentioned earlier, not being able to meet extortion fees, protection fees, taxes, whatever you want to call it. The fact is that these are imposed on them. They are very small business owners, some of them, who are told you need to pay X amount of money, and or else. If you don't, this is the possibility. And if they don't, we have heard of cases where they have suffered the death of a family member. And then that threat continues on to the other family members. We have seen where there are females who are targeted and are abused. There are those young men, some young men, who are forcibly recruited. And because they refuse, then they are threatened, they are harmed, and that could go all the way up into their immediate or extended family members. And so these issues, it's very difficult for those of us who do not come directly in contact with these people to understand, to imagine, much less understand. The safety that we have in Belize is what attracts these people. And one of the things that we really look for at the department is that, fine, we understand that we have persons who need jobs, but these persons come with skill sets that sometimes are not available in our marketplace. Let's benefit from that. We have been able to partner with UNHCR. We're looking at the sharing of this burden, of this responsibility, because as you mentioned earlier, you find that 85% of the refugee population is in developing countries. And so we look to others who are in solidarity, those countries that can afford to fund, for example, projects that will allow us to be able to engage these persons beneficially. You know, where we will be able to benefit, they will benefit, and the local community will benefit, the host communities will benefit. So we're saying where these people are settling, if we have a population of 3,000, 1,500 are maybe asylum seekers, or 1,000, the entire 3,000 population will benefit. And we end up with a win-win situation. You get the safety and the survival that you need, and we are able to benefit from what you contribute to our society. These people are very innovative. And so when we sit with them, our hearts go out to them. You know, we only hear of these things. We only see these things on television. We don't live these things. But the humanness in us asks us to reach out to them. And it's something that's doable because the United Nations organization, through UNHCR, is able to provide that platform out there that says, we need your assistance. We want to do these projects, but we need the funding so that we can assist the government in doing that. While the resources from the government side might be limited, for example, the department itself calls for a big chunk of resources. But then the other part of that is where we partner with those in the region, those other countries in the region, and extra-regionally, through the UNHCR office. And that's how we're saying we can do this.
All right. So how is World Refugee Day being commemorated in Belize, and how can people get more information about this process?
Yeah, our centerpiece of the World Refugee Day commemoration this year is the storytelling expo that we are going to hold at the University of Belize Gymnasium in Belmopan on the 20th of June. We had an interesting outreach project with young kids in the refugee hosting areas in the south, around Bella Vista mainly, where they have, through their own means, told stories of their daily lives that have been documented on video and in painting that are going to be portrayed at this event. And we're very much looking forward to receive interested public to that with us. And until then, there is still a number of other activities available. In the run-up to that expositions, we are still running our itinerant Referral Procedures exhibition that comes from last day's World Refugee Day, which has paintings from refugee artists around Latin America. It's currently visible at the House of Culture in Benque, and it will move on to Dangriga. A number of other activities also available. You can contact our PI officer who will be informing about the details.
Well, thank you for coming in and updating us on the status of refugees in this country.
Thank you for having
and
us.
also understanding more about the work that you do.
Thank you for having us.
All right. We're going to go ahead and take our final break, and when we come back, we'll have our wrap-up, so stay tuned.